Hi, I'm Atul Gawande, and I'm going to be talking to you about mechanisms of improvement in healthcare. I want to start with a study that fascinated me. It's a picture of the last 200 years of healthcare in one slide, in one graph. And it shows the survival rate of patients at the Mass General Hospital from 1821 to 2010 over the costs per person. And what you see is that through a century and a half, healthcare costs were exceedingly low for healthcare that was exceedingly ineffective. But then in the last 50 years, we've had this tremendous drop in the mortality of people coming to hospital care, whether for pneumonia, a heart attack, you name it. Now, the costs of that care as the technologies and capabilities increased, as we got antibiotics, as we got the ability to do open cardiac surgery, transplants, and you name it, the costs skyrocketed. We got insurance in 1965, and that allowed us to cover those costs. But while there were gains, there was not a lot of traction and concern about the costs. When we started to see that the mortality rate in the last 10 years has flattened, but that the costs went from $25,000 per person discharged from the hospital alive to $35,000 per person discharged alive, that's when people started to raise real questions. What are we getting in quality and value for the amount of money that we're spending? I think of this as a problem of how we're handling and delivering on the complexity of what we can do in medicine. We blame a lot of things for why healthcare can be so costly and difficult to deliver, and for why the quality doesn't seem to be what it should be. We blame malpractice, we blame the insurers, we blame the government, but at the root of it is complexity. And we point to a lot of other industries that have managed to do better in quality and safety over time. They've accelerated their ability to avoid major errors. And one of those industries is the aviation industry, where there is extensive safety, protection, and features, and a lot of different systems in place that have prevented airplane crashes, made them exceedingly rare, despite the complexity and the number of people traveling by air in the world. Now, I was interested in asking, how did they make this change? How did they go from being, like us, a profession governed by whatever the pilots thought were the right things to do, to actually having systems around the pilots that made them safer? And I could pinpoint it turns out, to a specific date, October 1935, when this airplane had its maiden public voyage. It was what became the B-17 bomber. And the U.S. Army had asked for proposals for a new airplane. The Boeing folks came forward with this design, which was unusual because it had 4 engines instead of the usual 1 or 2 engines on the plane. That meant it could fly higher, farther, faster, with 5 times the payload of any previous long-range bomber. So when all of the other competitors brought their planes out, this one was the one that put it all to shame. In October 1935 at Wright Airfield, they then brought this plane out for the flight competition to show the generals exactly what it was capable of. The generals watched it take off and lift into the air and then crash onto the ground, killing the crew on board. There was an investigation, and what they found was there was no mechanical failure. It was, they said, pilot error. The trouble had turned out to be that the placement of 4 engines on the plane made it a much more complex airplane to fly. Each plane engine had you had to adjust the pitch of the propeller, you had to adjust and monitor the fuel to oil mix, you had to pay attention to the settings on the trim tabs that controlled the air, the surfaces of the wings. You had the retractable landing gear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the process of going through to making sure that all these things were set, the pilot forgot one thing, which was to unlock the elevator controls. And so the plane just climbed and climbed and climbed until it lost air and then crashed to the ground. The Army concluded that it was too much airplane for one man to fly and canceled their plans for this plane. Boeing, expecting a couple hundred planes were going to be ordered, had built factories and were in threat of going bankrupt. Congress forced the Army to buy half a dozen planes. And when these planes arrived on a runway a couple years later at an Army air base somewhere, the pilots looked out on this plane that had arrived and said, "We can fly this thing. I know we can do it. We just don't want to die in it." Now, what was fascinating to me was as much not only what they ended up deciding to do, but what they decided not to do. When we think about how we improve performance in any complex task that human beings take on, we have graduated through a series of stages. It starts with what I'd call the primitive stage. We train people. You should do X. You should remember to unlock the elevator controls. You should remember to give an antibiotic before an operation in order to reduce infection. You should remember to put central lines in only if you've washed your hands, and that can prevent infections in ICUs. Well, you should do X. And what we see over and over and over again is that people forget. Or they just plain don't do it. The elevator controls don't get unlocked. And so we graduated to what I'd call the medieval approach. You must do X. We have guidelines. We have standards. We have regulations. Or if we're being nice about it, we'll pay you better if you're going to do that. Now, what was fascinating to me is that the pilots did not take our medical approach, which is to do exactly these steps. They did not say, we're going to have a pay-for-performance program for flying the B-17 bomber. They did not say, we're going to have a 3-year fellowship training program in how to fly this plane. Instead, they made a checklist. This particular checklist is very much like the one that they would have used at that time. On a single card, it has the most common failures that a pilot, an expert pilot, would still make, including on here, making sure that the elevator controls are set. And with a checklist like this, they were able to fly that complex plane nearly 2 million miles without a single mishap. The Army concluded that you could fly this plane, ended up ordering more than 13,000 of these planes, and they became part of the backbone of our air superiority over Europe and Asia in World War II and helped turn the tide of that war. Now, we've hit our B-17 moment in healthcare. The complexity of what we try to do has exceeded the capacity of any individual clinician to know and have the skill to do everything that we are supposed to be able to do. We've devised 6,000 drugs, more than 4,000 medical and surgical procedures, and our job has become to deploy that capability town by town to every person alive. And when you think about what they did in aviation, all they did was recognize that the individual capacity had been exceeded by the knowledge created. What they were doing was taking us to a modern level of improving performance. It was recognizing that you needed to make steps that made doing X, remembering to unlock the elevator controls, the norm of what you do. It could be a checklist. It could be a default system. It could be an information feedback loop or any other range of systems. We took this approach when the World Health Organization came to us to understand how do we reduce deaths in surgery. And what they were recognizing was that as the world got older, as people survived childhood illness, they were experiencing a world where now they were dying in road traffic accidents, from cancers, from heart disease. And so the net result was that we now do more operations in the world than there are childbirths, but with death rates 10 to 100 times higher. And so the puzzle was, what can we do to begin to change those death rates. We postulated that it was the complexity that countries and practitioners all over the world were finding very difficult to handle. And so we brought a Boeing engineer to help us understand how they would look at this problem. And they said they would start with a basic checklist. You would break it down into pause points, moments in care when you could pause and make sure that the most critical things that could be skipped or forgotten were not skipped or forgotten. And so there was a pause before a patient is put to sleep in this first column, the before induction of anesthesia check, a pause for a check before an incision is made, and then a pause before the patient leaves the operating room at the end of the operation to make sure that, that a few checks were made. And these were a mix of what I'd call dumb checks. Do you have the right patient on the table? Are you operating on the right side of the body? Did you give an antibiotic in the last hour before the incision is made? But then there are the interesting checks, because there is no recipe for a successful surgical procedure. And those interesting checks were about making a team more effective in handling whatever comes. And so there's a conversation. Has everybody in the room introduced themselves to one another? Do they know the goals of the operation? How long the case will take? How much blood loss to be prepared for? Well, with this kind of checklist in place, we rolled it out to 8 cities around the world, intentionally including some of the richest settings to some of the poorest, from Toronto to Tanzania. And what we found was that in every hospital, the complication rate fell. The average reduction in complications was 35%. The average reduction in deaths was 47%. And it's since been validated by others elsewhere. Now, what you were learning was that a simple system, it's not that the checklist is the be-all and end-all, but the idea of a system that could be usable by a team of people to help organize the care could be remarkably powerful, more powerful than any drug, any device we've introduced in surgery in the last decade. It has been able to be introduced all around the world to thousands of hospitals, from Eastern Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa to Asia. The rollout has been confirmed in more than 4,000 hospitals. And what it's beginning to show us is that we can graduate in healthcare to what I'd call the modern version of being able to improve performance, with putting in simple systems that dramatically improve the results of care. The essentials to being able to make this work are that you have to be able to not only design the system, though, you have to be able to implement it. And implementation is often taken for granted. You cannot just mandate that everybody stick this up on their wall and that this will change care. A checklist does not work if you do not use it. But to create use means that you have to get people to understand that the culture of practice needs to change from one that valued autonomy of the clinician as first and foremost to one that values humility and discipline and teamwork as being first and foremost. Some of the principles then in being able to implement are that you need to be able to create an implementation team with all of the major clinical members. You have to be able to pilot test and get feedback and make modifications in your plan. You have to get local champions. You have to have one-on-one conversations. You have to train people as a team. And then you have to coach people afterwards, even after you've rolled out, to keep improving what you're doing. The Veterans Administration system in the United States rolled this surgical checklist out in exactly that way across 74 medical centers. And what they found is it took a year, but by the course of that year, they reduced the death rates 18% compared to controls in a large rollout. The major barriers we see in being able to really change the systems of care, if these kinds of changes can save so many lives, why don't they just happen? And this is where the money and the complexity come together. We did a study of insurance payments in American hospitals and found that in looking at 14 hospitals, that their payments actually rose when they had serious complications. Their profit margins went up from $17,000 for a private paying patient for a surgical procedure to a $56,000 profit margin if there was a complication. No hospital's trying to have complications to make money, but the idea that they would invest in making sure these basic systems begin coming into place, putting in the resources to make that happen, that has been slow to occur. And that's why we're recognizing that to increase the value of care means putting both of these ideas hand in hand, being able to move into a world where we are combining new systems that make care better and the incentives that reward people for achieving them. The last thing I'd say is there's one more stage in how we improve care in the long run, and that's that the complexity of care could be replaced in the future by even automation. And that is likely to be some of the most powerful and fascinating steps for public health and for healthcare in the next generation of innovation. I thank you for the chance to talk to you today. I wish you all the best.